And what Wittgenstein does is he juxtaposes these languages. So one of the great things about Wittgenstein is that first he recognizes the power of language. I mean, the power of language is the fact that I can say something fresh and new now, which is presumably understandable, hopefully understandable, and yet which has not been experienced before. Usually when we recognize something, it's because we recognize it, we see it again. Here is a new sentence that we've read from Dostoevsky or whatnot, fresh and brilliant. Yeats talks about the golden apples of the sun and the silver apples of the moon. Okay? Wonderful language. Okay? Altogether new, fresh. We understand it and we appreciate it. That's a power of human intellect that language alone has. Not only do we recognize it, but we can formulate new sentences in ways that, so that series of combinations is, now how is that possible? So that's why he did the Tractatus. And the Tractatus is, in a certain sense, a series of rules that he thinks articulate how our common language works and what the conditions of our common language are. And he thought that he could capture it all with these seven propositions and the sub-propositions under these seven propositions. He was highly optimistic because he said in his last proposition that the rest is silence, everything else is incorporated in what I've said previously. And he got at the concept of sense, he thought, with the way in which he understood language.
Whereof we cannot speak, we must pass over in silence.
We must pass over in silence, yeah. The investigations are in juxtaposition with that, not because the Tractatus is wrong, but because the Tractatus is overambitious, because it represents the difference between a system that is structured on a pattern, much like Platonic vision, structured on a pattern, as distinct from one here that allows his thoughts to go wherever they go. And when it focuses on a particular topic, it sees this topic as only a glimpse of the whole landscape. The metaphor of the investigations is that of seeing things from the vantage point of an observer who is describing the landscape, but never exhaustively, because inevitably you are seeing it from one perspective rather than another. Which doesn't mean there is not an exhaustive account. It means that one has to move among different perspectives in order to see the whole landscape, see? And there is no such thing as seeing, of knowing, because there are things you see from one perspective that you just don't see from another. So that's the metaphor of the investigations, in which case he then moves with an interlocutor through a whole series of problems of Augustine's theory, and then the development of common names, common expressions, and development of, and then the theory of definite descriptions, and then the theory of understanding, the theory of reading, and all the rest. And he said, I want my two books to be published side by side. And why did he do that? Because I think he never wanted to repudiate the Tractatus. What he wanted to say is that these are two aspects of the human mind. The human mind works for the essence of something. It wants to get to the center. It wants to get to the necessary and sufficient conditions of a condition, and uses a pattern and tries to exhaust the discipline on the one hand, On the other hand, it recognizes that if it's a live and a vital thing, it is inexhaustible, and that it continues and moves on, and that these two aspects of recognition, I think, were part of his intention in this way.
With the investigations, I think of it as being a very disorganized, almost a book that is more properly in a box than in a pair of covers.
Well, in a way that's true, because Anscombe and Rees and the other guardians of the estate here found little clippings, you see, and they sort of pasted and so forth and so on. But it's, and it could have been in a box, so to speak. But there is an organization to it. Reading it over and over, you recognize that there are topics that merge. You get around 256, and you're into the private language argument. You see, you're at 155, 156. You're into the question of reading. It's an extraordinarily interesting discussion to ask what the nature of reading is, how one is able to transcribe from the written text into a verbal text, the transcription process, and how one describes this process of reading. Because spoken language presumably was first. Written language is the homophone. We get the sounds here, which are contemporaneous with the words that we speak, and we get a system of organization of sounds to do that. Well, the written language, he has a marvelous set of suggestions about reading. Reading is transcribing. Reading is guiding. Reading is deriving the spoken word from the textual word. Reading is translating. A whole series of conceptual accounts, none of which really stand up to scrutiny. It's a sui generis process. But to say it's sui generis is simply to make the point that all of these terms are introduced from outside. Derivation, for example, is introduced from the concept of deriving, say, a salt from salt water, for example, you see. Where you derive is always a residue of some kind. And there's no residue in translating text into sound or understanding how that goes. And this is quite independent of meaning. So what he's suggesting is that the conceptual apparatus of the human being will always be, will always and inevitably be incomplete. There'll always be a kind of incompleteness in our accounting of our practices, and that this is what gives us the encouragement to recognize that it can undergo more scrutiny, that something can always undergo more scrutiny and can be redescribed in different ways. You see. And
did I understand?
That's why we have, for every generation, we have a new series of books on Napoleon and on well-trod ground, but fresh in a certain way for this generation. And philosophy allows for